For this little live stream, we're going to be going over which systems are better for liberty, either socialism or capitalism. But before then, I'm going to post the my Patreon information in the chat. It's also going to be in the description for those who are interested. It goes from $1 to $100 for the minimums of each group. If you go to the website, you'll see a little bit more information on that. Just for people who are interested in helping me along, as I am on disability, it does help me for producing each of these live streams and each of the podcasts that I do. I do 2 live streams a day, one at morning, one at night, and a podcast during the middle of the day that covers one issue, and that does help me along for making a living, because I'm not at the level of ad revenue. And anybody who really donates, it would really be appreciated. When we get up to the level of getting enough people in, I will start to do little giveaways for people who are the higher levels, and that would really help to kind of generate some more income of that. Interest in that, that'll be probably something of some type of vintage type of coins that I would basically find from one of the major dealer that I go for gold and silver rounds and bars. Obviously, it probably would not be 1 ounce with it, because a lot of the vintage coins are not full 1 ounce. But on to this, what the topic is for the week, or sorry, for the day, is what system retains more liberty, socialism or capitalism. Basically, we need to understand is when we talk about socialism, we are talking about what's people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are bringing forward. So we need to be really honest with what it is, and we need to start. We need to dispute what their points are when they tend to talk about it, and then we need to state what capitalism is, and we'll be comparing both crony capitalism and laissez-faire capitalism when we're discussing this. The crony capitalism we're talking about is essentially what was brought forth by the progressives that started to mix in social programs to begin with. Now, these social programs, you're going to notice, is going to be very, very similar to what's to what they're going to try to address as socialism in their argument. And that's going to be what they're going to try to address as, because they're not going to want to address what true socialism is and what the outcome would be. And this is one major thing that needs to be understood. And when we're talking about this is what we could have. Now, essentially, we have 3 different options with this. What we have is crony capitalism, which is kind of mixing in socialism ideas into laissez-faire capitalism. We have socialism, real socialism itself, which is going to be the end result of what Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez want. And then you have laissez-faire capitalism, which is a pure capitalism, removing these social welfare programs from the actual thing and letting just socialism run free, as it did before, when we would actually help develop the nation to its actual level, where it was actually able to grow before the progressives started putting these weights on the actual economy that actually caused essentially development to slow to a near screeching halt. And if you look at why things have actually not developed at the same speedy pace from basically the foundation of the country, where we saw the foundation of the country up until the late 1800s, compared to the late 1800s to the current day, why you see there's a huge discrepancy in the development of things, why things have not developed at a faster rate. It's because when you start putting more and more economic programs on it, it's going to weigh down the actual development of the economy. And the more things have been weighed on it, the slower it's gotten. And this is why when they had the idea of we'd have like these flying cars, when they had these ideas that they would put into cartoons in the 1960s, the reason why we don't have them is because the fact is they thought we were going to keep on the same pace as we had to date, and they didn't realize that the weight of what the progressive era did, and being that it continued through, that it caused the same problem, and that more and more weighting of this system caused this damage. And that's what you get with the crony capitalism. Now, what they tend to point to is they'll tend to state things like Norway and Denmark. And when we look at those, we see that those are actually not socialist countries, but actually, when we look at those, you'll see that they are actually market economies that are actually implementing socialist programs within those market economies. This would assume that what they're doing is essentially doing what we've already done with it, just basically allocating their money in a different manner. But they've essentially just copied what we were doing essentially in the 1940s. Putting in extremely high tax rates and allocating their money in certain manners, and doing it in that such way, and essentially that's what they're doing, and they're just repeating what we did in the 1940s. And when we see that, we can see that basically that's nothing of the sort. That's nothing of the sort of socialism. That's actually in the fact just crony capitalism or progressive economics of what we did during the progressive era. Now, basically, when we start to look at real socialism, you will see that goes under the idea of Lenin or Stalin or Mao or Castro or Chavez or the Khmer Rouge or these other systems like that, and even going into Idi Amin, going into the ideas of even Maduro now as well. So when we start to look at these people, because obviously with Chavez these other people and what they try to do is they try to say that they'll say that well, that's not. They'll tend to state that, oh, that's not true capitalism. They try to tie it to certain names. While we say that it doesn't always, or Hitler, and as well is another one. Now, while they don't always end in that, it's pretty much that the majority of these systems always, we're talking the majority of the systems tend to end in that. In most cases, we're talking that these systems will basically have a lead to a lot of loss of liberty because of the way these systems structured. Essentially, what needs to be understood is what socialism or communism are. And it needs to be understood that basically what it is it's not the and this is what we're getting is from a reasonable thing. Is from Reason Magazine, from David Harsanyi. I believe I pronounced his name right. This is from an article from 2018. And he points to what not all of them end in that thing with. But here's the thing: we have the majority of these regimes ending in a very, very. What he doesn't point out is the majority of these regimes are ending in the same situation of always ending in democide. And if we're talking about this, we need to understand is that they always have, basically, you're always going to have this idea of what it comes down to. And we need to understand what socialism and what communism is. And it's basically essentially handing all of your rights, your values, and and your money over to the government. The government controls everything, instead of basically stating that the people control everything. Essentially, that's what you're doing at that point. The government now divvies up everything out, including rights. They then declare what rights you have, which then, because of that, they become privileges. You then have the privilege of free speech. You then have the privilege of all of these things that they state, and they can pull them away at any time. And people tend to argue, oh, but you get free healthcare. Well, they can pull that away at any time, and because of them having their essentially controlled economic systems, they don't know what they're doing. Because no centrally controlled economic system, as you see in the United States, we have a central bank that doesn't know what they're doing. Because when we look at their outcome, we can, and this is from crony capitalism, we can state that they do not know what they're doing. They didn't. I mean, we have a former Federal Reserve chairhead that was actually put in when she was completely unaware of the 2008 crisis. She basically stated before it came about that there was nothing wrong, and that was Janet Yellen, and yet she became the head of the Federal Reserve bank, and that's basically where they sit at. So they're basically completely incompetent, and this is basically what happens when you centralize things. They are incompetent, and when you get these things, and that's basically what you're doing. You're creating a centralization for all these programs. Doesn't matter food or healthcare. And healthcare needs to be rationed just like food and everything else. And that's why you'll have people complaining. I mean, even at your best case scenario for healthcare, just for a basic checkup, you'll have people complaining about that for these universal healthcare people. And they realize that they have to pay a lot of money for just decent healthcare out on the side. I mean, when it comes down to it, this is why these systems don't work. And they're stating that basically what they want to do is essentially take everyone's private health care and take it. When it comes to private health care, they want to take all their health care away so that they don't have an option. Now, when we come to the idea of these systems, such as what they have in the United Kingdom, they're not even doing that. They're allowing people to pay for private health care. Now what's happening in under these ideas that are floated by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders and some of the other people that are saying for universal health care, they're stating that they want to essentially abolish private health care, which essentially is getting rid of the right for people to have this. And that's something that's completely different from what is seen in these other countries that have this. I mean, they usually have a backup system to where people have the rights to purchase private health care, and that's something a lot different because they shouldn't be suffering with a system, and that's something that you would have to suffer through the system. As we see when we go to these centralized systems, is what is the best for liberty. Now, your liberty should be being able to choose. Do you want to participate in the system? Now, we see that basically is that you shouldn't have to participate in a system that you don't believe in. And when we see the actual cost of these systems, we see that they're far more expensive than actually any type of private health care, and the actual what it would be for the United States, and the actual outcome is going to be far worse. Because when we look at we actually already have something that is universal health care, and it is very expensive for the taxpayer, and it's called the Veterans Affairs. This is health care for the military, and we saw what happened with it. We saw what happens with that. We have them basically essentially making people wait a long time. Basically, when the people die, scratch them off the list and say basically they never existed. And this is what happens. And that's not exactly the way healthcare should be run. And when you see this, when you see them stating that we want universal health care, it's not going to be basically you can go in like you currently can go in with paid health care. That's not the way it's going to work. Because frankly, what's going to happen is when you start to add an influx of all these people, and then basically states that due to this, all of your workers are going to have to take a pay cut. Mind you, that this is another thing that's going to have to happen, that basically because they're only going to pay so much, is this is going to be a forced pay cut on the healthcare workers. It's basically going to lead to people getting very, very poor healthcare, and this is something that is notorious with socialist systems. And there's a big difference between what needs to be understood is there's a big difference between actual social programs, which are synonymous with the idea of these systems such as crony capitalism. Those have social programs. Those are what it calls that's completely different from what is actual true socialism. True socialism is a complete centralization of the economy and everything, where you're basically handing everything over to the actual government. You're saying that I don't want any rights, I don't want any liberty, I don't want anything. Basically, I want the government to control all of my economic liberties and all of my personal liberties. I want to basically hand everything over to them. And that's essentially what socialism is. It doesn't matter socialism or communism. That's the only difference is basically how they handle it from an economic standpoint. There's just a slight variance when we're talking about that. There's only a slight variance in specifically how they handle it economically. But crony capitalism essentially is doing what the progressives did, and essentially adding social programs to the government. Social security, welfare, universal health care, any type of health insurance programs. These are food stamps. These are things that are essentially crony capitalism. That's what's part of social welfare programs. It's a progressive idea, and you'll find it from the progressive era, and you'll find a lot of Nordic countries still do this, and you'll find a lot of countries in Europe, actually Europe as well, still do this. Now, how does this compare with some other areas with it? You need to understand that it's a lot different. from actual real socialism? Well, the fact is we need to understand that what you need to find with socialism is Venezuela. This was a country that Bernie Sanders praised before it fell apart, when the economic system essentially fell apart, and all of a sudden he turned tail. And the reason why he turned tail is because it wasn't looking as good anymore. And he realized if he started to praise them, it basically would have made him look foolish. But the fact is what these systems like Venezuela are that is real socialism. That's what happens. They basically, because central planners are incapable at any type of system of planning anything, they're incompetent just naturally, and people know this, and that's when they do these things with it, there's going to be crashes naturally, and there's going to be massive mistakes that are going to be made because they don't know what they're doing, because they don't know better than the markets. And what ends up happening is that you get these massive problems. Now, it doesn't matter if we're talking a central bank, normally in a crony capitalist country, as the United States has, where maybe you only have one central planned part, such as the banking industry, which can cause a massive, which does cause a massive problem. Or you can actually have this through a bunch of other things, such as you're doing it with food. Now, when you do it with food, think about what that did to the housing crisis, and now you're adding that over to food, or you're adding that to healthcare. Now think of the actual implications. And that's what happens when you go to socialism or communism. And this is why we're talking about, this is why when we need to talk about liberty, what actually have more liberty? Well, because you're not actually, you're actually handing over those rights over because of how the system works. When we start to look up the actual definitions on the actual government itself, you'll see that specifically of what socialism is. And you look at Merriam-Webster, you do not look at Google for your definitions, because it's not going to be accurate. And there's a reason why, is because Google is never going to be accurate, because they're always going to have a slight spin, because they've been busted before with some of their things trying to claim that Nazi, the National Socialist Workers' Party, was right-wing, when it was clearly, when you look at his when you look at Hitler's actual platform of universal health care, paid daycare, free education, free government jobs, raising the raising the standard of living through the government. And you'll start to see that it's basically it's a lot different than what people actually thought of what it was. And you could see that it wasn't actually something that's would have ever been right-wing, because right-wing refers to basically economic conservatism. When we look at the actual way a map would go on the ideas, basically left-wing is meant to be socially liberal, right-wing is meant to be economically conservative, and then you have, when you start to go down the map, it's meant to be more libertarian, basically meant to be smaller government. And when you go up the map, you start to go toward, or actually down the map, I should say, you start to go to being more statist, basically meaning bigger government. And now when you get to the idea of Merriam-Webster's dictionary, we see it states that any of various economic and political theories advocating collective or government ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods. A system of society or group living where there is no private property. A system or collection of society where the means of production are owned and controlled by the state. This means that basically there is no that the people have no rights to anything. The government owns everything. The government owns everything. The government essentially owns the people. And what they try to do is, what you'll see is they'll try to do is use the idea of democracy. Well, in the theory of that with it is we're not actually a direct democracy. We never have been, we never will be. And this is what they try to do. They try to act like a democracy is something noble. Democracy is merely just basically is just the act of voting. So basically, you're going to vote anyway. There's no country out there, with the exception of actually legitimate monarchies that would not have a voting system. So other than those, we're talking that basically is ones that actually have governments themselves that actually have voting would automatically be some type of monarchy or actually democratic that are not a monarchy, or basically some type of either democratic republic or a parliamentary republic. And a parliamentary republic is basically the same idea. It's just a slightly different arrangement. This is a slight variance thereof. It's basically, are they going to be a little more like the American system or a little more like the British system? And that's basically it. And that's the only two differences between the two. And when we're talking about it, but when we get into this with it, so when they try to use the term democratic, it just refers to voting. Basically, if you can cast a vote, well, that doesn't mean anything. So in the end with it, basically when they're doing that, essentially is you need to view them as being nothing different than the National Socialists. Because eventually, if you look at their platform, you need to view them as the same thing, because the National Socialists were voted in, and they were very protectionist. And if you look at the Democratic Socialists, they're very protectionist as well. And you look at the platforms of exactly everything that they fight for, it's the same exact stuff. You'll basically find it's the whole exact thing, the same thing when we talk about that, and that's something that's very important to understand. And this is something that's very important that needs to be understood when we're talking about liberty here. And you essentially, when we talk about this, is if you have to go to the government to actually deal with your rights, and if they control your rights, we know that it's going to be an issue for the actual people of the actual nation. And when we talk about how a nation actually deals with itself, it should be a problem for it should be an actual problem for the actual country, and how you actually deal with liberty. And when we're talking about liberty, you should want the maximum. And this is why when we start to look on the actual theory of how we actually get liberty, we want the actual smallest government. And we know that the bigger government gets, which there's no bigger government when we start to get to socialism and communism, that it's going to give you the least amount. Even under crony capitalism, you still get a reduced amount of liberty. The most liberty you're going to get is on the smallest form of government. Now, obviously, you don't want to go toward an anarchy system with it, because it does leave you vulnerable to invasion of any other type of system, which means you are vulnerable to any type of invasion of a socialist or communist intruder or dictator that wants to come in and try to take over the area when you believe in the non-aggression principle. And this is why you want to kind of go with that necessary evil and go with the smallest government. But this is why we had the Constitution set up as being this idea of the smallest government and giving the people the power over the state. And this is the whole point. When we look at the actual writings behind the Constitution and the how it was meant to, the Constitution, the way it's written, was to essentially, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and some of the writings beforehand that were actually meant to show as instruction of how the actual system was supposed to work, and give historic precedent behind it. It was supposed to show how the actual system was supposed to work, where the government was supposed to be severely limited in its scope of anything it was supposed to do. And this is where we find the actual activities of the government were basically limited at best. And it was meant to basically be where people could actually get their actual output of what they wanted to do, and they were free to kind of engage in whatever activities they wanted. But it wasn't until they started to grow the government that this tended to be limited, and people tended to view this idea of the living document, and which is under the progressive era, and big time. Obviously, people tended to try to stretch the idea previously. There were presidents previously that tried to stretch the powers of the federal government over what it needed to be, but we had previously to where they tried to do other things. But when we look at it, is when we look at the idea of liberty. Liberty is also always where people maintain power over the government. When the government's able to basically start saying, we're going to choose the winners and losers, and in this case, this would be that they're able to start basically taking things away from people to say, we need all of this free stuff for the people, that we're going to decide what the people are going to do. We're going to decide what's in the best interest of the people. You've essentially lost a great deal of liberty and freedom of choice. They've taken all of that away. And they've done that because they don't believe that that you deserve any freedom of choice. And this is the whole point. And and if they actually want to look on reducing cost of things, they need to realize what has raised the cost. Well, it's been government intervention. And government intervention raises the cost of everything. And the other factor that raises the cost is basically the inflation that comes from the actual central banking. So stop trying to centralize all of these things and stop trying to intervene. You do that, and which is a way to increase more liberty, and you're going to get cheaper things. You're going to get better outcome for the people, and in the end, the people are going to be happier and more wealthy. and it's going to yes, it will take wealth out of the elite people, because the wealth was never theirs to begin with, and the wealth was actually the people's that they were stealing through government intervention and government centralization. And this is the way it was happening, and that's through crony capitalism, which is essentially what's happens in these what's happened through the 20th century to current, and the late 19th century as well. And what needs to what we need to understand is you need to end that, and you need to essentially move on and get to where people can actually earn an actual living. And you need things to be done voluntarily, and we're not doing that. And the more voluntary, the more things done by voluntary exchange we get is and eliminating government from actually being a part of the voluntary exchanges as possible. We want to basically make sure the government is not a part of the discussion of anything. Government should not be, it should not be what role does government play in every decision. Government should play nearly no role in our lives. It should be basically, we shouldn't even think about government when we're thinking about what our decisions should be. We should be able to go along with our basically daily lives without ever thinking about government. And that's the whole point. Is government has basically made it to where basically everything we do with our lives is involving government. You have to do it for this, you have to do it for that, you have to do it for this and that and this and that. And when we get to, and this is why when you get to socialism, they want to essentially crush you even further. And you're not going to have more liberty, you're going to have less. Because they're going to decide what rights you have and what rights you don't. And when they do this, your lives are only going to get worse. And basically, this is what needs to be understood: is liberty only gets less when you go under these systems. I mean, do people need to understand the democide numbers on of these socialist and communist regimes? I mean, this was not because of just rare cases of dictators. This was because of those governments. I mean, you could have the worst leaders in the history of a capitalist society, but you've never had anybody becoming murderers to their people. I mean, the worst case scenario in a even crony capitalist society was FDR. And FDR was a person that's was basically FDR and Johnson, and those two basically were basically people that, one, established a lot of the establishment of Jim Crow laws and vetoed reparations to the as a Democrat, vetoed the reparations to the black people. And then you also had FDR putting Japanese Americans in internment camps. So I mean, this was about the worst that you actually had as presidents, as leaders of essentially, that was essentially what we're talking about as leaders. And when we're talking about so when we're talking about the system of leaders, I mean, we're talking like Andrew Johnson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt were about the worst. And that was that's pretty much something that needs to be understood. And even those were about and those never engaged in anything that would be considered as democide in our nation. They weren't basically committing these horrible, horrible acts that these other people like Pol Pot were doing, and that people like Maduro are doing, that Chavez has done, that Chavez is basically was stealing people's businesses that they had built up for years and taking their livelihoods and giving them nothing. They're basically saying, hey, you're out with nothing, you lose everything with it, you have no livelihood. And these people crying because they have nothing to show for their whole lives. Because the fact is, he basically says, you know what, I'm going to steal your company. And these people basically had their whole lives ruined because of socialism. And you had what you call people in the U.S. Like John Oliver saying, yay, yay socialism, and basically cheering on that some guy had his life ruined because of the fact of that a person had their life ruined just because of the fact that he was an actual business owner that actually had built up a successful company. Now you ruined a person's life because of that, and you're cheering this on, and this is basically what they did. And now we see that this is what socialism is about. It's about ruining people's lives, and that's not about liberty. The idea of actual ideas of voluntary exchange is trying to make sure that the customers are served and that you can develop the best business possible and make it as big as possible. And to see that basically under socialism, you can just basically steal it and say, you know what, this is mine now, and basically ruin someone's life, basically take their hard-earned property and say, this is the government's property now, kick them out, basically give them nothing. When even under the Constitution, you at least have to give them fair value for anything taken. And yet under socialism, you can just say, you know what, we're just going to take it. And this is why we talk about the differences in liberty between capitalism. Even crony capitalism has to give them at least somewhat fair value if they're going to take anything of it. Because you need to have, in any type of buildings or anything, when it comes to the actual value of a company, they essentially, if the government wanted to buy out that company for its actual value in its rights, they would essentially have to buy out that company at the company's value. And they would essentially have to give that guy fair value for his company if they wanted the actual rights to anything, if they felt it worthy for the actual government itself. They couldn't just say, you know, we're shutting you down, and we're shutting you down, we're taking over your company. If the government felt the legitimate value for the actual country and wanted to take ownership from the actual government and only, they would essentially have to offer that company fair market value per the Fifth Amendment. This is why the Fifth Amendment exists there. And even under crony capitalism, they'd have to do that. Even if there wasn't a legitimate reason, they would still have to do that. And then laissez faire would definitely do that as well. I mean, but in socialism, they could just take it and tell them, basically, you're out, this is ours, end of story. And this is why we talk about what liberty is. It's not just economic liberty, it's also personal liberty. This is something that a person took their hard-earned money with it from the ground up and built. I mean, if you basically built a home from the ground up, and then the government's just going to say, you know, we're just taking it. We're not going to offer you anything. Get out. I mean, you would be quite angry at that situation. I mean, you would have some serious anger toward your actual government if the government did that. And that's the same thing with it. That's why when we have people actually, a lot of times when we see cases of eminent domain abuses, we have people siding on the side of the private owner of property. And we see when we see eminent domain abuses with it, we see usually people railing on the side of that private property owner for that reason. And this is what the case, and this is essentially what they will do. They will essentially but in the case of that, they're not even offering fair value. They're just offering $0 and saying get out. And there is no actual case. It's just get out, and you're out. You have no choice. And they'll essentially tell these, in this case, business owners that they're fired, or in this case, maybe a homeowner, that they're taking their property. And that's what needs to be understood. And these are cases that happen in socialism all the time. And it might be for a property need for a military base or for whatever. And they'll tell people that there's out. Leave. We want this property, so find another place. And that's the difference. And that's the difference you're going to find between socialism and capitalism, regardless of what type of capitalism we're talking about here. And this is why when we get to the root of it, there is no version of socialism that has ever worked in the benefit of the people, and why we look to the idea of the actual socialism governments killing their own people, because the people go, hey, hold on a minute, wait, this is not fair nor right, and it's for the actual rights of the people, because they look toward that all the free stuff that you're offering is not worth for what the treatment of the people are getting. It's not an even trade-off. Your free health care and free education, no matter what it is with it, it doesn't matter that I'm getting it free with it. I have to wait for all this stuff with it. It's being rationed as well, and then basically I lose all of my actual rights for this stuff, and basically I'm at the beck and call of the actual government, whatever they want to do to me. You essentially take the role of a slave, and that's why rightfully so is socialism is referred to as slavery. And when we get capitalism, they can't do that, because we're talking it's a bottom-up system. When the people have the rights over the government, it makes it much more difficult. Even in a crony capitalist system with it, they at least have are bound by a certain degree, even with certain people taking the living document section of that point of view. And that's what needs to be understood with that. I mean, even with that section, I mean, even with people taking the living document or going with precedent, I mean, there's still that whole point of people doing that, and it goes down to the if people still have somewhat of their rights over the government, and the government is still limited to what they can do. Obviously, laissez-faire capitalism is much better, and it will give people the complete rights over the government from abuse. But sometimes you're going to have to push a little bit harder, because you're going to have people that are going to not view the system in the way that it should be. but in both ways, with it is still far better for liberty than any system of socialism could ever dream of being. Because the fact is what you need to realize is that in the end is you're going to get basically some stage of where the National Socialist Workers' Party was in Germany. Essentially, you're going to have people blamed with it, their stuff taken, and eventually these abuses along the way, and eventually you get to democide. And that does eventually happen within countries. And this system of democide happens in these majority of the countries. We're talking, when we're looking at these countries that have adopted socialism or communism, we're talking in upwards of close to like 80% of these countries. And when we're talking at that high of a percentage, you're talking, you don't want to be rolling the dice with that. That means if we're talking at something like a normal six-sided die, you basically better be rolling the exact number that you need, otherwise you're going to lose. If we're talking, if you're a betting person. Because the fact is the system that we're talking about here is there's not a lot of systems in which there's not a lot of events in which they have not gone on to kill their own people, and that's just the nature of the system, because there's people that basically say, you know what, I don't like this, and they go on to shoot their own people. Either they'll shoot them in the streets, they'll run them over, they'll basically put them into death camps, they'll put them into work camps, basically deliberately work them to death, not feed them, which is another form. They'll run multiple forms of these with the intention of killing them. And there's multiple ways that they can actually do this, and they always end up doing this to execute them. And there's multiple ways that they can do this. They can do medical experiments on them. They know that they're going to die, and it just boils down to what they're going to do. And they're doing this deliberately, knowing that they're going to die. And you're not going to find this in a capitalist system. This is just not what happens. Even in the internment camps for the Japanese, they didn't die. We're not talking that the purpose was to get them to die. It was just to separate them from the public and use them in just the same idea as a prison camp. That's though it was what I call considerably a very, very dark time, and I think that when we were talking about that, that was even because of the links of socialism with the president himself, with FDR, especially when we're talking about his correspondences with Mao and Mao and Stalin. We could see that there's a potential links with there, that we're talking that he could have essentially gotten the idea from that. And that's where we get the whole problems with him. So essentially that's where the essentially why we had that being essentially completely different from what had been done in the past. So what we get is that pretty much when you get capitalism, you're pretty guaranteed to have your liberty fairly safe. Yet when we get to socialism, you don't have any liberty whatsoever, because they become privileges from the actual government. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell. Share us on social media when it comes up. Share it with your friends and share it with everybody publicly. Make sure they subscribe and try to get them to donate to my Patreon, which is right down below. And if you're interested, make sure you donate to the Patreon below as well. Bye, everyone.